Chapter 13, The Education of Intelligences. It is time to beckon back to center stage the three figures whom we first encountered at the opening of this book. There is the Puluwat youth in the course of acquiring those vaunted navigational skills I have already reviewed in the discussion of spatial intelligence. There is the young Islamic scholar capable of that facility at memorizing that I noted in treating linguistic intelligence. And there is the Parisian adolescent seated at a computer terminal, preparing to compose a work of music, a young person who is combining, in a way scarcely imaginable some years ago, aspects of logical, mathematical, and musical intelligence. It was in an effort to understand better the skills involved in these disparate feats, to offer an account of the educational processes that develop such competences, and to consider how these competences can be assessed in an appropriate way that I initially undertook this inquiry. I have, in preceding chapters, examined each of the candidate intelligences in some detail, and have also undertaken a critique of the theory. Then, in Chapter 12, I began the process of relating the raw and relatively autonomous intellectual competences to the concerns and practices of the larger society. I described the way in which the use of symbols develops in normal individuals, and I considered how human intelligences can be marshaled in the service of specific roles by the symbolic systems, codes, and interpretative frameworks of the wider culture. Though arguably valid, this picture still has focused on the developing individual. Consistent with the psychologist's biases, the culture has been viewed primarily as a backdrop, with its products and systems a means of fostering personal development. But one may examine the same encounters, the same sets of circumstances, from a vastly different perspective, that of the society at large. After all, from the point of view of the culture, numerous individuals are continually being born, each of whom needs to be socialized according to prevailing norms, values, and practices. It is the means used by the society, and in particular the various modes of education and training, that will concern us as I consider here the education of intelligences. The anthropologist Jules Henry reminds us of the central role played by education in all societies from the earliest days. Throughout his historical course, Homo sapiens has been a status seeker, and the way he has had to follow, by compulsion, has been education. Furthermore, he has always had to rely on those superior to him in knowing and social status to enable him to raise his own status. Instructing the young in the tribal ways is as natural as breathing. Adults have a vital interest in the children they teach, and they often seem to have even a broader interest in the tribal existence as a whole. Surely, in focusing on the educational process, we are considering a domain of utmost importance in all cultures, as well as an optimal area in which to observe the intelligences at work. And yet, as we shift our perspective from the individual to the educational situation as a whole, we move into largely uncharted waters. The number of variables entailed in describing educational systems is so enormous that any hope of controlled experimentation or of scientific modeling must be suspended. My mode of presentation, accordingly, becomes increasingly descriptive and elusive. Furthermore, in the final pages of this book, I become yet more speculative as I consider the options available to the educational practitioner, and attempt to lay forth the problems that he or she confronts and even to offer some practical suggestions. It is only fair to warn the reader of this significant change in scope and in tone. I trust that the shift is justified by the urgency of the educational problems being faced the world over, and by the need to consider these problems from a perspective broader than that of the solitary individual. In this effort to elucidate particular forms of learning as they are found in the world today, I shall proceed as follows. First, I shall briefly survey the major components of any educational situation. Components including the kinds of intelligences that are involved, the principal transmitting agents, and the general context or situation within which such transmission of knowledge occurs. Taken together, these components constitute a framework that can be applied to any educational situation, and that should point up similarities and differences among diverse educational situations. Following the introduction of this framework, I will consider in turn the three educational situations embodied by our three prototypical learners: the youthful navigator, the Koranic student, and the young programmer. Of course, to isolate any trio of instances is radically to reduce the range of educational variation actually encountered in the world today. It is important to underscore, then, that these examples are used only for illustrative purposes. I will actually draw on information about numerous comparable educational settings as a means of arriving at generalizations about three prototypical forms of learning. 1. The acquisition of specialized skills in a non-literate society, exemplified by the sailor. 2. Attainment of literacy in a traditional religious school, exemplified by the Koranic student. And 3. The transmission of a scientific curriculum in a modern secular school, exemplified by the programmer. A principal reason for developing an analytic framework is to explain why certain contemporary educational efforts have achieved success, while many others have met a less happy fate. I shall turn to this task in the concluding chapter of the book. To aid us in this effort, I have in the final pages of this chapter considered three components that typically occur together in modern secular education: attendance at a school, acquisition of various literacies, and deployment of the scientific method. It is, after all, the coincidence of these independent factors that gives the contemporary Western educational setting its peculiar flavor. And it is through an examination of these factors and their consequences that we may come to understand better the operation of educational processes quite different from our own, and the difficulties that arise when attempts are made to impose our forms upon other cultures. I begin by listing the various components that should be taken into account in the analysis of any educational encounter. Given the complexity of any situation in which one or more individuals are charged with the transmission of knowledge to another set of individuals, it is essential to consider a large set of components, and thus, unfortunately, to be confined to a summary account of each. With this brief aside to the potentially perplexed, I shall turn first to a component of special import in this book: the particular intelligences used in an educational encounter. Even this component turns out to be multifaceted. For example, the abilities entailed in an intelligence can be used as a means of acquiring information. Thus, individuals may learn through the exploitation of linguistic codes, of kinesthetic or spatial demonstrations, or of interpersonal bonds. Even as various intelligences can be exploited as means of transmission, the actual material to be mastered may itself fall squarely within the domain of a specific intelligence. If someone learns to play an instrument, the knowledge to be acquired is musical. If someone learns how to calculate, the knowledge to be gained is logical mathematical, even if the means is linguistic in nature. And so it turns out that our various intellectual competences can serve both as means and as message, as form and as content. Related to but separate from, the intelligences involved are the actual ways of learning exploited in one or another setting. Perhaps most basic is direct or unmediated learning. Here the learner observes an adult activity in vivo, as when a Puluwat child watches an elder construct a canoe or prepare to sail. Closely related to direct observation but involving more overt participation by the learner are various forms of imitation, where the child observes and then imitates, either immediately or subsequently, the actions performed by the model. In these forms of observational learning, spatial, bodily, and interpersonal forms of knowledge are often at a premium. Linguistic knowledge may also be involved, but typically in an incidental manner, for example, to call attention to a feature of the performance. Sometimes adages or general propositions are invoked as well. At this point, know that is joined to know how, but instruction in a specific skill may also occur outside the context in which that skill is customarily practiced. Sometimes a small model is constructed so that the learner can practice. For instance, the young Puluwat sailor learns the star configurations by setting up pebbles on the floor of a canoe house. Sometimes a ceremony or ritual is held, in which the learner is exposed to secrets or given specialized practice that can be utilized later on in context. And as societies become more complex and tasks more intricate and multifaceted, learning takes place increasingly in contexts remote from the actual site of practice. For example, in those special buildings called schools. I shall examine such elaborated forms of learning as I turn to schools, ranging from informal bush schools to traditional religious schools, to those contemporary secular schools with which most readers will have an intimate familiarity. As we survey these different ways or settings of learning, we encounter three additional variables that must find their place within any equation of learning. To begin with, various means or media are used to transmit knowledge. While direct forms of learning are largely unmediated, involving at most a simple verbal description or a line diagram sketched in the sand, more formal forms of learning rely heavily on discrete media of transmission. These may include articulated symbol systems, such as language or mathematics, as well as an ever-expanding family of media, including books, pamphlets, charts, maps, television, computers, and various combinations of these and other modes of transmission. Naturally, these media differ in the kinds of intelligence required for their proper use, as well as the kinds of information that they present most readily. Next, there are the particular sites or loci where learning takes place. Much education, particularly in traditional societies, takes place on site. The learner is simply placed near or gravitates toward the model, who is at the time doing his thing. On-site learning can occur at home, when that is the customary locus of the activity, be it learning how to prepare a meal or coming to identify with a parent who is always studying. As I have already noted, when societies become more complex, they are likely to set up specialized institutions for learning. Schools are the most prominent instances, but ateliers, shops, and laboratories where apprenticeships are available are also pertinent examples. And sometimes specialized settings, such as those used for initiation rites or ceremonies, facilitate the rapid and effective transmission of pivotal knowledge, and as often, potent affect. Presumably, almost any kind of information could be transmitted at any site. But as I have suggested, linguistic and logical mathematical forms of knowing are most likely to be transmitted in settings devised expressly and used primarily for the transmission of knowledge. A third variable in the equation of knowledge concerns the particular agents entrusted with this task. Classically, teachers are parents or grandparents, generally of the same sex as the learner. Other relatives or members of one's caste or clan may also serve as the repository of special wisdom. Siblings and peers are often transmitters of knowledge as well. In fact, for some tasks, children learn more readily from their older siblings than from unrelated teachers. Not infrequently, there is a pairing of individuals within a culture. Youngsters end up being trained by those adults who possess the skills that are most important for them, the youngsters to acquire. This kind of matching may occur because of blood relationships, proximity, or less typically, a perceived fit on the part of the community between the model's skills and the youngster's aptitude. Such matching is more likely to occur in societies with informal schooling. Finally, in certain societies, there emerges a wholly separate class of teachers and leaders, initially religious, later secular in orientation, whose job it is to teach some, or perhaps even all, the youngsters in a community a given body of knowledge. Sometimes the teacher is expected to have an exemplary moral character, though in secular settings, technical expertise has become the key requirement. Possibly for the first time, a prior relationship between the child and the adult is no longer a necessary precursor for entering into an educational relationship. Instead, one encounters a contractual situation where residence in a geographical area or membership in a religious body suffices as an entry card into an educational relationship. A word, finally, about the general context in which learning takes place. Each of our prototypical instances of learning tends to occur in a particular cultural context. In a traditional non-literate society, most learning is considered a requirement for survival. The same forms of knowledge are accordingly found among all or most inhabitants. Relatively little knowledge has been drawn up in explicit codes, and most required knowledge can be accrued simply by observing individuals at practice in their customary milieus. As these forms of knowledge are relatively straightforward, I shall not consider them further here. Instead, I shall turn to those forms of knowledge within a traditional society that do require a lengthy learning process, such as engages our young Puluwat sailor, or a youth who is becoming a bard in a non-literate Yugoslavian circle. In societies where literacy is transmitted in a traditional religious setting, a somewhat different state of affairs obtains. Here, a certain segment of the society, usually the young males, acquires a skill that will set its members apart from those who lack it. There is a gradual winnowing process, as a result of which some individuals end up with but a smidgen of this specialized knowledge, while the most knowledgeable persons become the religious or the secular heads of the community. Outside the school setting, there may be further division of labor. Often, however, the relatively simple technological and economic structure of the society permits most individuals to possess the same general set of skills and knowledge. Representing an opposite extreme are modern technological societies that feature a wide range of roles and skills. As no individual can conceivably master all of them, there is considerable division of labor, with institutionalized formats for the transmission of knowledge and explicit standards for assessing success. Nearly all acquisition of skills takes place in specialized settings, ranging from technical schools to ateliers, from factories to corporations. Whereas in the traditional society, nearly everyone has some understanding of the knowledge possessed by others, the technological society features experts, whose particular store of knowledge proves as mysterious to the average citizen as does literacy to the non-literate individual. The kinds of intelligence that are highly valued differ markedly across these disparate contexts of learning. In the traditional non-literate societies, there is a high valuing of interpersonal knowledge. Spatial and bodily forms of knowledge tend to be heavily exploited, while linguistic and musical forms of knowledge may also be at a premium in certain specialized circumstances. In a society that harbors traditional religious schools, linguistic knowledge comes to be esteemed. There is a continued cultivation of interpersonal knowledge, accompanied at the highest levels by the fostering of certain forms of logical mathematical knowledge. Finally, in modern secular educational settings, logical mathematical knowledge is at a premium, and certain forms of linguistic competence are also of value. In contrast, the role of interpersonal knowledge is generally reduced, even as intrapersonal forms of understanding may loom much larger. I have briefly surveyed an analytic framework and a set of categories that can be applied to a range of educational settings and experiences. Naturally, any application of this framework must be preliminary and tentative, pending both close observation of the particular society in question and the development of means for applying the categories in an unambiguous and reliable manner. One can gain a feeling for how the framework might be applied to our three specimen settings and to others of comparable scope by studying the chart on page 355. Of course, the chart samples just three possible cultural settings. A consideration of other educational settings would no doubt yield many other combinations of features and might as well bring to the force agents loci, media of transmissions, or forms of intelligence that have not been considered here. Indeed, one virtue of such a framework is that, far from being Procrustean, it can help bring to our awareness aspects of the educational equation that might otherwise remain invisible. Until a few thousand years ago, nearly all human beings lived in societies where energies were consumed in providing for basic needs, primarily through hunting, gathering, farming, and the preparation of food. In such societies, most forms of knowledge were widely shared, as it was important for individuals in the society, or at least for all members of one sex, to be able to provide for themselves and others for whom they had responsibility. By and large, these forms of knowledge were acquired relatively early in life by the young, usually through simple observation and imitation of the adults in their families. There was little need for explicit codes, specialized training, or articulated levels of gradation or skill. But even in non-literate societies, one finds skills that are complex, highly elaborated, and restricted to individuals with considerable expertise. And it is these skills that are of particular significance for our inquiry. Sailing in the Puluwat Islands in the Caroline chain of Micronesia is an excellent example of such a skill. The status of master navigator, achieved by only a handful, perhaps half a dozen, of males in the society, proves extremely difficult to attain. Indeed, many males do not even attempt to acquire any more than rudimentary knowledge of sailing, and of those who make the attempt, substantially fewer than half complete the course and become skilled navigators. By the same token, the building of canoes is also an elaborate skill, which requires considerable training and is achieved by only a small minority of the population. From the study undertaken by Thomas Gladwin and reported in Chapter 8, we have obtained considerable understanding of the processes involved in becoming a Puluwat sailor. Gladwin delineates two distinct courses of learning that are necessary for eventual success in navigation. One portion of learning is oral and takes place off-site. It involves the committing to memory of vast amounts of factual information, such as the identities and locations of all of the islands, and the identities and courses of all the stars, which the navigator could conceivably need to know. Gladwin points out that there is no need to keep this lore secret, because no one could possibly learn it, except through the most painstaking and lengthy instruction. It is taught and memorized through endless reiteration and testing. The learning job is not complete until the student, at his instructor's request, can start with any island in the known ocean and rattle off the stars both going and returning between that island and all the others which might conceivably be reached directly from there. This aspect of Puluwat navigation, which relies on linguistic intelligence, is necessary but scarcely sufficient for the aspiring sailor. The more important part of his training can be acquired only by considerable practice at sailing. He needs a first-hand acquaintance with the currents, with specific conditions that obtain in traveling between various groups of islands, with the system used for keeping track of distance traveled, with the kinds of information that the waves convey, and with the procedures for navigation in storms, for finding one's way in the dark, for forecasting the weather, for dealing with sea life, and for using the stars to guide one's course. Much of this process involves the building up of mental models, so that the navigator can conceive of himself traversing his course with everything moving past except the stars poised overhead. For these core aspects of sailing, linguistic knowledge proves of little help. At a premium are keen sensory capacities and the deployment of spatial and bodily kinesthetic knowledge. Forming an instructive contrast to the Puluwat navigators are those individuals in rural Yugoslavia who become singers of oral verse. According to Milman Perry and Albert Lord, hardly any formal training is involved in becoming an epic singer, an individual who can sing, for example, a different song, all night for each of the 40 nights of the Islamic month of Ramadan. Rather, the future singer simply listens night after night to the performances, learning the plot of the story and, more important, the various linguistic and musical formulae out of which new performances are constructed. After years of such listening and absorbing, the individual begins to practice the formulae himself, learning how to expand or ornament songs he hears, or perhaps even to create new songs. According to Lord, it is a process of imitation and of assimilation through listening and much practice on his own. Finally, the singer has the opportunity to perform the song in front of a sympathetic but critical audience. Here at last, he has the chance to see whether the feat that he has mastered, by observation and solitary practice, can exert the desired effects upon members of his community. Both the Puluwat sailor and the Yugoslavian singer attain a high level of skill, one that sets them apart from others in their society. In both cases, a capacious linguistic memory, subjected to extensive rehearsal, is an important possession of the would-be expert. But whereas the sailor depends on his spatial and bodily abilities, the singer is reliant on his musical abilities and also on the interpersonal skill of communicating with an audience. Nearly all of the learning by the Yugoslavian poet takes place on site, without formal instruction. He is, in a strong sense, self-taught. In contrast, explicit teaching procedures are used for Puluwat sailors, and at least some of these take place off-site. For example, in a canoe house where pebbles signify stars. In the case of learning to build canoes, the offspring almost always works with his father, but in the case of navigation and oral verse, kinship ties themselves do not suffice. Many members of a family will lack the abilities or the inclination to become skilled practitioners, and it is possible for an otherwise talented individual to succeed even if his own kin are not engaged in the aforementioned skilled activities. Nonetheless, as in most other activities in a traditional society, one is far more likely to engage in an activity and to attain high levels of expertise if that activity has belonged to one's family's customary pursuits for many generations. The acquisition of such expertise by a small caste within a traditional society is, as I have said, something of an anomaly, because most activities in the society are within the ken of all normal adults. Indeed, all adults in the Puluwat Islands have some rudimentary navigating capacity, even as all adults in the Yugoslavian society have some knowledge of oral verse. As we move toward consideration of a schooled society, we encounter an environment in which specialized knowledge becomes more common. Our understanding of such societies may be increased if we consider briefly three institutions that one may find within a traditional society, each of which stands apart from the normal course of observational learning and thereby anticipates the more formal processes associated with a schooled society. We begin with a more formally organized occasion of learning, the initiation rite. Much written about, these are ceremonial occasions that can last for hours or for years. Typically, youths of a culture are subjected to challenging experiences and asked to master particular behaviors or information as a step, often the decisive one, in effecting the transition from childhood to adulthood. Sometimes these rites are brutal. A youth may be subjected to harsh physical pain, as among the Thonga of Africa, or left alone in the wilds for long periods of time, as in the case of some American Indian tribes. Sometimes, as among the Tikopia of Polynesia, the rites are more benign, as the ceremonies are performed by relatives and there is much affection, celebration, exchange of gifts, and food. One might well ask what is learned through these more or less traumatic rites of transition. Whether they should, in fact, be considered occasions of learning. Answers in terms of sheer volume of information are probably beside the point. In general, the initiation rite is better viewed as marking a change of status than as an opportunity for mastering skills and lore, though in certain cases, for example during the 3-month circumcision rite in Senegambia, much learning does take place. But coming to understand that one is now a member of the adult society and that there are specific expectations and privileges connected with that role is in itself a crucial form of knowledge in traditional societies. One's beliefs about oneself constitute a powerful factor and reflect an assessment of whether one is able or unable to perform in the prescribed manner. Here is a task central to the development of intrapersonal intelligence and of a sense of self. Moreover, the initiation rite also marks a time of intensive, effective learning. Learning about one's feelings and one's relationship to others in one's group. The tension, thrill, and fear surrounding these experiences probably serve as a model for those affects associated with other important experiences in life that the youth must learn to handle. For instance, hunting, marriage, childbirth, and death. The individual's relationship to his community is confirmed as he undergoes these rites, even as it is undercut if, for some reason, the initiate does not perform adequately. One might regard the initiation rite as a kind of crystallizing experience in the personal realm. A critical moment when the child turned adult must come to grips with the range of feelings that he has as a person in his own right and as a member of the larger society. While such effective and personal forms of learning can perhaps be telescoped into days and months, other skills in a traditional society take a longer time to master. This situation has given rise to two other institutions, neither of them schools in a fully institutionalized sense, but both lasting for longer periods of time and sharing some of the characteristics of a formal educational institution. The first of these is the so-called bush school, a separate locus where an individual child can learn how to perform arts, crafts, and other skills important for the life of the community. In traditional West African bush schools, boys and girls are enrolled for several years and are trained as part of a secret society. The Grandmaster is an individual of high status. The youngsters are divided into groups according to ages and aptitudes and receive instruction in the assorted lore of native life. Included also are tests to determine individual aptitudes. There are mock battles and skirmishes to test one's war-making abilities. As part of involvement in the bush school, there is an initiation rite where the youth attains a new name. Those who do not show sufficient endurance may simply be allowed to die. In some of these schools, there is a particular stress on the historical background of the population as a means of stimulating group consciousness, political sophistication, and greater courage. One additional means of training those skills that are not readily acquired by sheer imitation or through involvement in an initiation rite is the apprenticeship system. In the most familiar form, as exemplified in the guilds of the late medieval period, a youngster leaves home during the pre-adolescent or the adolescent period, and goes to dwell for several years in the home of a master of a particular craft. There he first becomes a member of the household, running errands, watching the master at work, forming bonds with the other apprentices and those who have already become journeymen. When the apprentice is judged ready, he is slowly initiated into the skills of the craft, through the posing of more difficult tasks, through constant evaluations by the master, and through sharing of the secrets of effective craftsmanship. If the lessons are well learned and the interpersonal tie has been properly maintained, the apprentice has the opportunity to make his way to the higher levels of performance within the particular specialty. Admission to the Society of Masters itself depends upon the completion of a task or a piece that is suitable for the particular guild. This masterpiece is in effect the final examination. Ultimately, the journeyman will be allowed to join the ranks of the masters, to be privy to all of their secrets, and to take on apprentices in his own atelier. The apprenticeship system seems to have evolved in an effective form in diverse regions of the world, perhaps even independently, including many places bereft of literacy or schools. For example, the Anang of Nigeria have an apprenticeship system for the mastery of carving. While youngsters often learn from their fathers, a young man can learn to carve by paying a large stipend to, and serving a year's apprenticeship with, a master carver. There are even carving villages where numerous individuals specialize in teaching and practicing this craft. In ancient India, technical and other craft skills became organized into guilds, a practice that may, in fact, have given rise to the jati or caste system. In Egypt, the arabesque woodworkers have long had a lengthy and intricate apprenticeship system, whereby the secrets of that complex trade are slowly meted out to the most promising young individuals. And indeed, though not usually labeled as such, the procedures whereby the adolescent Puluwat gains skills in sailing can be considered a kind of apprenticeship system. Less able students are dropped during the rigors of oral memorization or of early trial runs at sea, while the most successful students are eventually granted admission to the small society of master navigators. The progression I have noted here is worth underlining. Forms of learning that are direct and unmediated suffice for relatively uncomplicated activities, but may prove inadequate when a process is lengthier and features elements that are not readily observed or comprehended by the untutored eye. Once skills within a domain have reached a certain level of complexity, sheer observation or even informed interaction with the instructor will rarely suffice to yield a product of quality. Accordingly, it becomes advisable for the society to develop formal mechanisms for ensuring that youths with promise are trained to high levels of proficiency. Both the bush schools and the craft guilds are mechanisms for increasing the probability that at least the more talented males in a society will achieve the necessary level of competence. Some division of labor within the society is essential for this procedure to work. In these forms of knowledge transmission, the technical skills, be they bodily, musical, or spatial, are rarely divorced from the interpersonal facets of life within a culture. The bush schools culminate in initiation rites, and the guilds themselves may be viewed as a kind of elaborate initiation rite, complete with secrets that are withheld, sometimes unnecessarily, simply to prolong the period of indenture. Individuals who do not possess the requisite interpersonal skills are unlikely to negotiate this series of hurdles successfully. Indeed, interpersonal sensitivity may prove as important as personal courage or manual dexterity. And oftentimes, the very opportunity to participate in the process depends upon pre-existing interpersonal ties within or between families. The emergence of bush schools and craft guilds also marks a transition from the direct methods favored by many traditional societies to the mode of formal schooling that has arisen in the past 1,000 years in many parts of the world. Formal schools arise from a network of reasons, the chief one of which may be the need for an efficient and effective way of teaching, reading and writing, to certain of the young in a society. With the rise of schools, we behold a transition from tacit knowledge to explicit forms of knowledge, from ceremonial rituals to technical requirements, from oral preservation of knowledge to written forms of communication, from a religious orientation to a secularized stance, and eventually to the rise of a scientific approach to knowledge. All of these are tremendously complex trends, none identical with any other, and none of them is as yet sufficiently well understood. Still, If we are to probe the educational challenges that today confront much of the world's population, it is important to try to understand the nature of schooling in its various guises and the ways in which schooling makes use of and develops the different intellectual potentials of individuals. Islam spans one-fifth of the entire world population, covering half of the globe. And from North Africa to Indonesia, young Islamic males undergo similar forms of education. At some point between the ages of 4 and 8, the young child enters a Quranic school. The word Quran means recitation, and the principal goal of these schools is, as it has been for centuries, the memorization of the entire Quran. Initial entry to school is an important and joyous time, marked by prayers and celebration. But soon attention turns to the serious business at hand. At first, the young child listens to the Quran being read and learns a few verses. He is introduced to the Arabic alphabet as he learns the names of the letters, what they look like, and how they are written. From then on, learning proceeds along two parallel tracks. Part of the curriculum involves regular recitation of the Quran. The child must learn to recite the Quran using the proper rhythm and intonation, which he acquires by imitating his master slavishly. The emphasis falls on the correct sound rather than on understanding the meaning, and many individuals will commit to memory the whole Quran, a process that can take 6 to 8 years, without comprehending the words they are speaking. Total recall of the Quran is considered a singular virtue in its own right, irrespective of whether its words are understood. The remainder of the curriculum involves learning to read and write Arabic, a process achieved chiefly through the mastery of the Quran. First, the student learns how to trace or write the letters. Then he learns to copy whole lines from the Quran. Later steps involve learning to write from dictation and coming to understand the meaning of the words in what is, to many of the children, a foreign tongue. While most students do not go beyond these elementary literacy skills, the most diligent and successful students are eventually allowed to read other texts, to enter into discussion about the meaning of texts, and to engage in the processes of argument, analysis, and interpretation. Of course, the details of Quranic education differ in various schools, in various parts of the Islamic world. The extent to which other subject matter, such as arithmetic, astronomy, poetry, or logic, is offered, and the extent to which learning of other languages or reading of secular texts is permitted differs widely across nations and social environments. But at the core of Islamic education everywhere, even today, is the linguistic mastery of a sacred text, a mastery that always entails oral recitation, and typically involves as well the gaining of literacy in the Arabic language. The regimen of the Quranic school, with its emphasis on rote memorization of a text in a language unfamiliar to the student, may strike contemporary readers as remote and even bizarre. It is therefore important to underscore that similar procedures and processes have characterized a range of schools that existed during the past 1,000 years, including many in medieval Christian Europe and other pockets of the literate world, such as the Hebrew cheder and yeshiva, the Islamic Quranic schools and madrasas, the Japanese terakoyas, the Hindu gurukulas. Following the work of Michael Fisher and of my colleagues Robert Levine and Susan Pollack, I will indicate a number of features that characterize these traditional schools. Obviously, there are instructive differences in these prototypes, but for the most part, it is remarkable how far similar features arose in disparate corners of the earth, which were hardly in constant contact with one another. As I have already noted, these traditional schools are almost invariably religious, operated by religious individuals for religious ends. Of course, in a society that supports traditional schools, there are few realms not permeated by religion. The teachers are not only religious personages, but are also expected to be individuals of high moral character who are afforded considerable liberty to punish wayward students, when necessary, and who are expected to serve as paragons of virtue in the community. An immoral teacher is seen almost as a contradiction in terms. The principal curriculum in the schools, particularly for the first years of education, is simple. The student must learn how to read and write in the language of the sacred texts. As this is almost always a language other than the vernacular, the students will be involved for several years in learning a foreign language. Also, little effort is exerted to make this language familiar and friendly to the user. The task is to learn the language through rote drill and memorization. Typically, one starts with letters of the alphabet, whose strokes are copied and memorized. Words and phrases are then copied as well, and soon the student is learning to produce and to memorize the sight and the sound of lengthier passages. It is pretty much left up to the individual to work out, on his own, the elements of grammar and of the sound structure of the language. Clearly, linguistic intelligence is at a premium here. The child so gifted, like our mythical Iranian youth, is most likely to succeed at this decoding. The sequence generally moves from mastering of the alphabet to decoding of the language to the understanding of the text. At the highest levels, individuals are able to move on to texts other than sacred ones and eventually to the public interpretation of and disputation over the meaning of certain texts. But this goal takes many years to reach, and most students never get beyond the memorization of the more familiar sacred texts. For the most part, students in these traditional schools are young males. In some communities, early education is obligatory, whereas in others it is limited or quickly reduced to an elite group. The first day of school is marked as a special occasion, and the child is given to understand that the opportunity to learn to read the sacred scripture is wonderful and properly marked by celebration. But pleasures become infrequent thereafter as daily drill and memorization take over. Individuals with skills in these tasks of literacy are rapidly separated from those who show little talent. A keen linguistic memory is probably the most important feature for advancement, and thus gifts or techniques for remembering well are at a premium. While memorization is often not the overt goal of the regimen, it seems to be a necessary step. After all, much of later interpretation and disputation presupposes rapid and faithful recollection of the text, which contains the relevant answers to the principal dilemmas of life, and whose existence has been the raison d'etre for the school in the first place. There may be periodic celebrations as major milestones are passed. Those individuals who, like our Iranian youth, succeed at their studies and are otherwise approved of by their community, are allowed to proceed to the highest level of studies, the yeshivas, the medieval universities, or the madrasa in the sacred Islamic cities. These individuals have the option of devoting their lives to scholarship, and even if they will never become as affluent as some of their peers, they are honored by their community. While linguistic and logical abilities have obviously come to the fore in this mode of training, the interpersonal aspects of traditional education over the centuries should not be minimized. Except for those relegated to teaching the very youngest children, teachers have typically commanded great respect. In the past, much of the educational process came to center on a single magnetic figure, a guru, a mullah, a rabbi, a Confucian scholar who took promising students under his wing and helped them to scale the heights of knowledge. Moreover, a primary purpose of the schools was to maintain social cohesion in the community, which supported the schools and took great pride in the success of the best students. While talent was often recognized and often rewarded, it did not occur in an atmosphere free of personal favorites, contacts, and bonds. The secularization and impersonalization of education had still to come and may never arrive completely. It must be underscored that these schools did not arise in a vacuum. During the medieval period, there was considerable contact among the religious groups that lived in areas surrounding the Middle East, and even frank borrowing of certain features among these traditional schools. Doctrines of competing religions often served as the focus for debate among those who had entered into the ranks of higher education. I must note as well the existence of definite differences among the systems, differences that I have ignored for the purposes of exposition, but that must be taken into account in any consideration of the traditional school. Religious schools themselves built upon earlier traditions, the training of scribes and copyists in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the scholastic institutions in China and India some 3,000 years ago, the classical academies of ancient Athens, where the Iliad and the Odyssey formed the center of learning, but where music, physical development, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, philosophy, and political leadership were all featured. Indeed, with the breakdown of the classical world, this varied curriculum fell by the wayside. Much ancient knowledge was lost, and the form of schooling that arose in the early Middle Ages was notably narrower. There was indeed a general feeling in the Middle Ages in Europe that the amount of information to be learned was finite. Richard McKeon comments that, If you wanted to know what the culture of the 12th century was, you could list, let's say, 3,000 quotations that every intellectual would know. You can tabulate it. The method of teaching, even at the higher levels of learning, was largely memorization through set question and answer formats, formalized definitions, or even whole lectures. Indeed, only a privileged few were allowed to participate in relatively free debate. Even at a university, students could not afford books and so had to memorize many lectures. This remained the case until the Renaissance, as can be seen by this description of an Italian Renaissance university before the widespread use of printing. The students had no notes, grammars, lexicons, or dictionaries of antiquities and mythology to help them. It was therefore necessary for the lecturer to dictate quotations, to repeat parallel passages at full length, to explain geographical and historical allusions, to analyze the structure of sentences in detail. Scores of students, old and young, with nothing but pen and paper before them, sat patiently recording what the lecturer said. At the end of his discourses, each of them carried away a compendium volume containing a transcript of the author's text, together with a miscellaneous mass of notes, critical, explanatory, ethical, aesthetical, historical, and biographical. In other words, a book had been dictated, and as many scores of copies as there were attentive pupils had been made. As Michael Fisher points out, in his instructive discussion of such traditional schools, this description could have applied to schools in Iran as late as the 19th century. The factors that gave rise to the various traditional schools were diverse and cannot be considered apart from specific historical, cultural, and religious conditions. Nonetheless, the surprising similarity in form in many parts of the world and over a long time suggests that we are dealing with a variety of education that was remarkably adaptive and exploited the ways of knowing of which many individuals are capable. Building on the role of memorization, which plays so important a role in a non-literate society, these schools continue to cultivate the art of memory while embroidering verbal recall skills with the ability to read, and eventually to write, texts that were not already known to the student. Recognizing the importance of a central figure as a transmitter of knowledge, these schools featured a respected and often charismatic master to whom students would feel a bond, and whose assessment of their progress would determine whether they could pass to the next level of achievement. While the institutions of learning were housed separately from the ongoing economic life of the community, they were scarcely estranged from the community. Rooted in religious practice, often located in temple or mosque, they were seen by all as absolutely central to the life of the community, and therefore could be considered in a sense on-site or contextual. Except for books, there were few media of transmission. Except for the most successful students whose participation in disputations invoked logical skills, the featured intelligences were those linguistic and interpersonal forms that have always held sway in a traditional society. Where they differed from traditional non-literate modes of education was in their relative indifference to spatial and bodily intelligences. Thus, while the traditional religious schools cannot be assimilated to the direct on-site learning of a Yugoslavian bard or a Puluwat sailor, their ties to the less formal institutions of learning are still apparent. Writing a few hundred years after the heyday of the medieval traditional school, the French author Rabelais ridiculed the constraining elements in this form of education. He wrote of the great doctor of theology, Master Tubal Holofernes, who succeeded in making his pupil stupider and stupider by forcing him to spend 5 years on the alphabet until he could recite it backwards, then keeping him for 13 years, 6 months, and 2 weeks on the worst of the medieval textbooks, until he knew them backwards too, and following that with 16 years on the crude late Roman compilers whose work had been all that was available for the early barbarians. Francis Bacon, writing at the beginning of the 17th century, declared that the method of discovery and proof according to which the most general principles are first established, and then intermediate axioms are tried and proved by them, is the parent of error and the curse of all science. Yet these critiques are one-sided. Medieval scholastic schooling was in many ways appropriate to the structure and the goals of the society of its time, and allowed the transmission of the most important skills and knowledge in an effective way. The decline of the traditional schools and the rise of the modern secular school occurred first in the West, particularly in England and Germany. Of crucial importance was the development of modern science and its gradual acceptance throughout Europe and North America. The many other epical, religious, political, economic, and social changes that occurred in the period from 1400 to 1800 are so well known and have so often been cited that it is unnecessary to rehearse them again here. But in their wake, there arose a citizenry much more in need of formal education, much more willing to sacrifice so that its children could gain that education, much more oriented toward the sciences and toward technology, much less oriented toward the learning of sacred texts and the reading of classical literature. As each of the great industrial revolutions occurred, the revolution of textiles and heavy machinery in the 18th century, the revolution of chemicals, electrical engineering, and steel in the 19th century, the revolution of computers and information technology in the 20th century, further changes have been wrought in the educational system. By now, the modern school in Europe, the United States, the Soviet Union, Israel or Egypt, India or Japan, bears little resemblance to the prototype that I have just sketched. What features came to distinguish the secular schools, those modes of transmitting knowledge that will be most familiar to, if not taken for granted by, readers of this book? First of all, secular schools no longer centered on religious texts and, in fact, began to treat all accumulated knowledge as equally within their province. Second, they were no longer staffed exclusively or even primarily by members of the clergy. Instead, there arose a set of civil servants, teachers in the employ of the state, who became the agents of instruction and who were chosen on the basis of intellectual credentials rather than of moral fiber. Education began early in life. Erasmus recommended that it commence at age 3, and some modern authorities would favor an even earlier age. The family sought to contribute to education in whatever ways it could. The use of the vernacular, of simple and direct forms of expression, of games, puzzles, and books written just for children became acceptable and eventually widespread. Females were permitted to study and eventually to teach. Finally, the overall goals of education changed. Education was designed to foster productive labor and proper citizenship within one's own country. It could also stimulate personal development and provide skills that individuals could use however they wished. Of course, individual goals differed from one secular society to another, and the extent to which any were fully realized is debatable. Moreover, the line between traditional and secular schools must not be overdrawn. Not all traditional schools were, strictly speaking, religious, and many otherwise secular schools have maintained some religious ties or moorings. But it is undeniable that most schools in the industrialized world have come to assume this secular garb. With a shift in type of schooling have come decided alterations in the mix of intelligences. Determining for certain just which intelligences were featured, in which way, is a task for future research, and any such determination must take into account the fact that shifts affect relative emphasis rather than the absolute presence or absence of a particular intelligence. Nonetheless, if one bears these caveats in mind, it is instructive to consider some of the changes that appear to have taken place over the centuries. To begin with, the relative importance of interpersonal intelligence has been reduced in the contemporary educational scene. One's sensitivity to other individuals as individuals, one's capacity to form a close tie to a single mentor, one's ability to get along with others, to read their signals and respond appropriately, assumes less importance now than it did in centuries past. In contrast, intrapersonal skills are continually, even increasingly, germane, as the individual must monitor his own reactions and plan his future course of study, and indeed the rest of his life. Certain purely linguistic skills are less important. With the ready availability of books, it is important to be able to read quickly and to take good notes. But skills of sheer memorization and uncritical parroting have little importance and may even be regarded with suspicion. Rather, a combination of linguistic and logical skills has been brought to the fore, as individuals are expected to abstract, synthesize, and criticize the text they read, and to devise new arguments and positions to replace the contemporary wisdom. And with the rise of computers and other contemporary technologies, even the word itself takes on less importance. The individual can now perform much of his work purely through the manipulation of logical and numerical symbols. Traditional schools replace the direct methods of spatial and bodily intelligences, with a stress on linguistic facility, while retaining much of the interpersonal element. The modern school places increasing premium on logical mathematical ability and on certain aspects of linguistic intelligence, along with a newly found premium on intrapersonal intelligence. The remaining intellectual capacities are, for the most part, consigned to after-school or recreational activities, if they are taken notice of at all. It is no wonder that individuals living in societies that had only traditional schooling exhibit severe strain when they are expected to make a rapid transition to a computer-centered educational system. An adolescent programmer. Let us pause for a moment to consider our hypothetical Parisian student who is programming a musical composition on her home microcomputer. This activity presupposes the evolution of a highly industrialized and technological society, as well as a degree of affluence that allows an individual to purchase equipment that was the stuff of science fiction a generation or two ago. After all, no one can build a computer society or a computer from scratch. Yet, what is striking is the extent to which our student can proceed on her own, having remarkably little interaction with other members of her culture. Equipped with the rudiments of programming, which can be acquired from a manual or a brief course, she is free to go to her terminal at will, to purchase whatever software she desires, and to produce works that meet her own desires and specifications. She is equally at liberty to revise, reject, or transform the compositions, to share them with others or keep them for herself. As much depends on her own planning, on her knowledge of what she wants and how best to achieve it. Intrapersonal knowledge assumes a central role in the activities she selects and in the ways in which she evaluates them. Similarly, she has greater leverage about important life decisions, role, mate, place of residence, than do her peers from a traditional religious culture. In working with a computer, she is necessarily embracing logical mathematical abilities to a far greater extent than do most individuals in most other societies. Life in a computerized society also involves a combination of logical mathematical intelligence with other intellectual forms, most typically linguistic. But, as our Parisian student exemplifies, logical mathematical intelligence can also be yoked to musical thinking. One may continue to exercise other intellectual capacities, such as spatial, kinesthetic, or interpersonal forms. But this pursuit remains a personal option rather than a societal imperative. The adolescent at work with her personal computer stands at the opposite end of an educational continuum, from a youth in a traditional society who is learning to hunt, plant, or make a simple tool, and is remote as well from the student at a cheder or a madrasa who is mastering a religious text. Still, it is important not to exaggerate the distinctions in the profiles of intelligence favored across different school settings. Certainly, interpersonal relationships retain importance in some modern educational contexts. For example, much of graduate education, in the sciences no less than in the arts, is based on the forging of a close link between the master professor and his promising students. While intellectual strengths of a non-personal sort may underlie the initiation of the link, its preservation over a long period of time constitutes an important ingredient in the younger colleague's eventual success within a field. It is also worth noting that nearly every society with modern secular schools has in some way tried to preserve aspects of traditional schooling. A society may have after-school religious education or weekend Sunday schools. There are frequently special schools for Hebrew or Islamic studies that individuals attend in addition to their secular schools. In Japan, teachers often cultivate certain traditional values in their regular classrooms, while their students attend after-school juku designed in secular fashion to prepare them for the rigorous college entrance examinations they must eventually pass. In India, the pathashalas exist to provide secular treatment of many disciplines, while the gurukulas are a throwback to an earlier era. And even within the modern West, one can also discern an attempt to maintain the classical orientation of the earlier traditional schools alongside the more scientific orientation of the modern secular schools. Thus, we have high schools of the arts and of Latin as opposed to technical high schools, and humanistische as opposed to technische gymnasia. And we can also contrast terminal elementary schools, devised to ensure that individuals will have some rudiments of literacy before they take jobs as laborers or farmers, with elite private schools, where aspects of classical education continue to be stressed even as a certain proportion of individuals is introduced to the lore and the methods of the sciences. Finally, the numerous optional or extracurricular activities available in developed countries ensure that the full range of intelligences can be cultivated, given time, desire, and a certain measure of affluence. Critiques of schooling. Because modern secularized schools have been a reality for many years throughout much of the West, our society has had the opportunity to reflect upon this institution, to identify its weak points as well as its strengths. We have been able to consider what may have been lost by an adoption of schooling in general, and by an uncritical acceptance during the past century of modern secularized schooling, with its focus on certain uses of mind and its relative lack of integration with the long-term spiritual and moral life of the community. This soul-searching has given rise in recent decades to blistering attacks on schooling by the gamut of educationally oriented scholars. There are Ivan Illich, who has called on us to de-school society, Paulo Freire, who objects to the use of schools as elite tools for manipulating oppressed people, Ronald Dorr, who condemns the credentialing function of schooling, where the focus lies on obtaining a diploma when there are few jobs available for the certified, Ulrich Nasser, who decries the narrow academic skills that reign in the classroom, Christopher Jenks, along with various other American commentators, who claims that schools as a whole do not even attain their avowed goals of helping individuals scale the ladder of success. Social class background and luck prove more important, and nostalgic commentators like Michael Maccoby and Nancy Modiano who declare, if the peasant child is not dulled by village life, he will experience the uniqueness of events, objects, and people. But as the city child grows older, he may end by exchanging a spontaneous, less alienated relationship with the world for a more sophisticated outlook which concentrates on using, exchanging, or cataloging. What industrialized urban man gains in an increased ability to formulate, to reason, and to code the ever more numerous bits of complex information he requires, he may lose in a decreased sensitivity to people and to events. These critics need not necessarily carry the day. A recent influential study by Michael Rutter and his colleagues in London indicates that schools can make a positive difference in the lives of children. If a school has sufficient resources, a competent principal, an emphasis on teaching by teachers who are punctual and responsible, and a clear and justly administered system of rewards and demerits, then children will tend to learn more, to like school better, and to avoid delinquent behavior. Similar reports come from the challenging environment of New York City. Principles and principles matter, and for populations who are disadvantaged, a program of early enrichment that begins to develop intellectual skills in the first years of life can have measurable long-term effects on student attitudes and achievement. It is not my purpose here, however, to take issue or sides with the defenders or the critics of schools. Rather, my analytic framework may help to identify those features of modern schools that are part of their explicit program, as well as some of the consequences that may be unintended side effects of such schooling, among those observers partial to spatial, bodily, or musical forms of knowing, as well as those who favor a focus on the interpersonal aspects of living. An inclination to indict contemporary schooling is understandable. The modern secular school has simply, though it need not have, neglected these aspects of intellectual competence. In contrast, those commentators who favor the cultivation of logical, mathematical, and intrapersonal skills, and the utilization of meritocratic rather than subjective measures of quality, find much to admire in the modern school. Still, it is worth noting that among the factors that contribute to the effectiveness of schools are the personal qualities of the principal and the teachers. Despite promises of a microcomputer alongside or in place of every desk, these individuals cannot be replaced, at least not yet. While the actual effects and effectiveness of modern schools can and will continue to be debated, the overall impact of a schooled society, as against one without formal education, is rarely a matter of dispute. It seems evident to nearly all observers that attendance at school for more than a few years produces an individual, and eventually a collectivity, who differs in important, if not always easy to articulate, ways from members of a society that lacks formal schooling. There are, of course, differences between the traditional and the modern secular schools. In terms of our overall framework, A society featuring the traditional school may be thought of as marking an intermediate point between a society without any formal schooling and a society dominated by modern secular schools. Whatever its preferred mode of transmitting knowledge, nearly every society in the contemporary world has had to confront the accomplishments of the modern, industrialized, or developed world. And few societies, whatever their doubts about the European, the American, or the Japanese examples, have been able to turn their backs on the educational systems of these societies and to remain content with their traditional forms of knowledge transmission. In order to make informed decisions about which paths to follow and which to abjure, educational planners have sought to understand better the effects and implications of the principal features of education in the developed world. Such features as enrollment in a secular school, acquisition of literacy, and mastery of the scientific method. Each of these areas is enormous, and none is as yet well understood. Moreover, they tend to be correlated with one another. Most contemporary schools in the developed world feature several literacies as well as scientific thought, and so it is scarcely a straightforward matter to disentangle the effects of each and to determine the ways in which they typically interact. Nonetheless, given the importance of these factors in any contemporary educational equation, it is germane to consider what is known about each form whenever possible in isolation, and to see whether its features can be illuminated by the framework that I have introduced earlier in this chapter. With these caveats in mind, we may consider the features that are generally believed to accompany this trio of factors. Probably the effects of schooling have been most often probed. Authorities generally agree that outside of schooled settings, children acquire skills through observation and participation in the context in which these skills are customarily invoked. In contrast, in the standard classroom, teachers talk, often presenting material in abstract symbolic form and relying on inanimate media such as books and diagrams in order to convey information. Schooling generally treats subject matter that one cannot readily see or touch, even as those sensory modes of taking in information seem singularly inappropriate for most school tasks, except for the visual act of reading. Children skilled in the ways of school are accustomed to the presentation of problems and tasks, often out of context, and learn to tackle these assignments just because they are there. Children learn to look for clues, to devise steps and strategies, and to search doggedly for answers that are not known. Some of the skills learned in school prove to be general. Once one can read a book on any topic. Once one can write on many topics. Skills of calculation, diagram reading, and the like are similarly versatile. Indeed, dealing with notational systems altogether may be a chief survival skill inculcated in school. Surveying a wide range of studies, Michael Cole and Roy d'Andrade indicate some of the consequences that one can regularly expect following years of schooling. Individuals who have been to school regularly outperform those who have not, on tasks where one must focus on language itself. Where specialized information processing strategies, like chunking, are required, or where one must spontaneously use certain taxonomic classification systems, putting together objects that belong to the same superordinate class. Conversely, one typically finds little or no difference between schooled and unschooled populations on tasks where materials are familiar, where the kinds of relationships sought after are functional, or where the desired modes of classification have been modeled in a familiar and non-threatening situation. Such findings underscore the effectiveness of school in calling attention to language and in teaching students to classify in certain ways and to use certain informational approaches. The missing skills may well be trainable even in unschooled children, but it is important to stress that they do not arise spontaneously in the course of tackling tasks, typically posed by experimental investigators. In terms of our framework, then, schooling involves a novel site of learning, outside of the usual context where skills are deployed for productive labor, with specialized agents of transmission and numerous media of transmission that are not generally featured in a non-schooled environment. This combination, in turn, cultivates mental skills that are difficult to acquire when transmission of knowledge occurs only in on-site, unmediated contexts. A more sophisticated and self-conscious use of language may well be a byproduct of most schooling, even as a new set of literacies and a commitment to logical thinking are frequent concomitants. The forms of personal knowledge will differ depending upon the kind of school. In general, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, and musical forms of knowing will have only an incidental or an optional status. Differences in schools will depend chiefly on whether they tend toward the traditional religious model, where linguistic and interpersonal forms are at the fore, or toward the modern secular pole, where logical, mathematical, and intrapersonal forms of intelligence prove most germane to the goals of the system. It should be noted that in some societies, such as Japan, strong efforts are made to foster interpersonal knowledge within the formal school setting. Furthermore, in some strict traditional schools, such as the Koranic ones that focus only on reading and writing, some of the cognitive revolutions associated with secular schooling may not occur. Turning next to the effects of literacy, we find discussions of a somewhat separate, though certainly related, set of skills. Like schooling, literacy encourages fresh and, in many ways, more reflective attention to language. In a non-literate society, language tends to be invisible. All that is noticed are the effects of what has been said. In contrast, in a literate society, the individual becomes aware that there are elements like words, that they are combined in certain acceptable ways, grammar, and that these linguistic elements can themselves be referred to, metalanguage. Individuals learn that it is possible to be precise and unambiguous in articulating what one means, to have a completely accurate record of what has been said, and to distinguish between what may have been meant, pass the salt, and what has actually been said. Would you mind passing the salt? Literate persons become able to relate readily with one another in other than a direct face-to-face manner. They can even come to know someone whom they have never met, and, if correspondence is possible, establish a relationship with that individual. Interpersonal relations can take on a new, hitherto almost inconceivable flavor. It may well be that, at least in certain contexts, the ability to read and write encourages a more abstract form of thinking, for one can now define terms with precision, refer back to facts and definitions that were presented some time before, and weigh the logical and persuasive elements of an argument. The capacity to employ various symbolized notations enables one to supplement one's memory, organize one's future activities, and communicate at one time with an indefinite number of individuals, the set of all potential readers. Mastery of different literacies, for example, reading musical scores, mathematical proofs, or intricate diagrams, exposes one to once inaccessible bodies of knowledge and allows one to contribute new knowledge within these traditions. And literacy may also have profound social consequences. The individual who can write may not only place himself in a powerful situation vis-a-vis his illiterate contemporaries, but may also establish a reputation as a certain kind of person. For instance, if he maintains faithful records of public transactions and uses them judiciously, he can serve as a kind of honest broker or judge of the behavior of other individuals. No wonder that chiefs of non-literate societies are often observed to feign literacy as soon as they become aware of its existence. So much for the alleged consequences of literacy. Even as Michael Cole and his colleagues have helped us to understand the effects and the limits of years spent in school, they have recently added materially to our understanding of the implications of literacy. Taking advantage of a unique experiment in culture, Cole, Sylvia Scribner, and their colleagues spent several years studying a group of Vai individuals in Liberia. This population is special because some inhabitants are literate only in English, some are literate only in Arabic, acquired in the study of the Quran, and about 20% of the adult Vai males have learned a special script restricted to their geographical region. A syllabary devised in the 19th century primarily for writing letters and keeping personal records. Though used for these valued purposes, the Vai script does not entail any contact with new knowledge or record scientific, philosophical, or literary information. The Cole team uncovered the surprising fact that attaining even a high degree of literacy in one of these systems does not in itself produce widespread cognitive consequences. In fact, it is the attending of school rather than the acquisition of literacy per se that produces most of the aforementioned differences in problem-solving, classification, and analytic skills, and even that sensitivity to language that might seem part and parcel of an immersion in literacy. What mastery of each script does accomplish, however, is the enhancing of certain skills integral to the practice of that particular literacy. Thus, Vi literates prove better than other individuals at integrating syllables into meaningful linguistic units, while Arabic literates have a selective ability to remember a string of words, as they must do in learning the Quran, but are otherwise not remarkable. On this analysis, literacy should be seen not as a panacea for various cognitive deficiencies, but rather as a set of specific cognitive skills that may have some generality but do not by any means change a worldview. It is literacy in the context of schooling that alters a larger family of linguistic and cognitive operations. We see then that a particular language-like skill need not have the revolutionary effects that typically surround it in a schooled situation. Consistent with the theory of this book, a particular use of linguistic intelligence does not necessarily implicate other intellectual strands. True, a general concern with literacies and notations is likely to produce an individual who is both aware of the possibilities of recoding information and facile in acquiring additional literacies, for example, new programming languages for the computer. Moreover, occurring as it typically does in a schooled setting, the acquisition of literacies enables the individual to master much additional information in a context-free setting. In a sense, reading opens up the world, but the Scribner-Cole study reminds us that we must be careful before assuming that any new form of education necessarily entails broad consequences. And indeed, as one considers the vast differences between a bush school and a traditional religious school, or between a traditional religious school and a modern secular school, it seems clear that the kind of school makes as big an intellectual difference as the fact of schooling per se. The chief pretender in our times to an altering of worldviews is our third factor, science, that body of procedures and findings that arose in the Renaissance and its aftermath, and has led to many of the most important innovations of our time. The adoption of scientific and technological measures has made possible unprecedented affluence, as well as numerous unanticipated physical and social upheavals. No corner has escaped its effects or its appeal. In the scientific method, at least two aspects work hand in hand. On the one side, there is an interest in collecting facts, a desire to be objectively empirical and to find out as much as one can about a subject matter, along with a willingness, or even eagerness, to change one's mind in the light of new facts. Complementing this descriptive aspect of science is the building of an explanatory superstructure, a theoretical framework that explains the nature of and the relations among objects and forces, how they come about, what can make them change, and under what conditions such changes are likely to take place. The theoretical structure depends upon reasoning, deductive reasoning, where implications are drawn from general assumptions, and inductive reasoning, where general principles are arrived at from the examination of individual cases. These elements existed to some extent in classical times, certainly in Aristotle's vicinity, and also in other corners of the world for many years. But it is the particular genius of European culture after the Middle Ages to have brought them together into a scientific synthesis, whose results have already been dramatic, and whose ultimate effects are incalculable. Much discussion of the differences between the modern and the traditional, pre-literate, or primitive mind centers around the role of scientific thinking. Authorities like Claude Lévi-Strauss have argued that the traditional mind is not fundamentally different from the modern mind. The same operations are used but applied to different materials. In fact, primitive science is best viewed simply as a science of the concrete, whose operations can be seen at work as individuals classify objects or weave mythic explanations. Other observers in sympathy with pre-modern ways of thinking have criticized Western science for spawning an ethnocentrism about our current way of making sense of the world, which they see as simply one of numerous equivalent worldviews. On the other side, authorities like Robin Horton have argued, to my mind rather convincingly, that while both scientific and non-scientific or pre-scientific ways of thinking are efforts to explain the world, there remains a fundamental difference between them. Specifically, in its effort to explain the world, the scientific mind includes a credo that involves the positing of hypotheses, the stipulation of the conditions under which a hypothesis can be rejected, and the willingness to abandon the hypothesis and to entertain a new one should the original one be disconfirmed. Hence, the system is inherently open to change. The pre-modern or non-scientific mind has available all the same thought processes as has the scientific mind, but the system within which the former works is essentially closed. All premises have already been stated in advance, all inferences must follow from them, and the explanatory system is not altered in the light of the new information that has been procured. Rather, in the manner described in my discussion of traditional religious education, one's rhetorical powers are simply mobilized to provide ever more artful justifications of the conclusions, the worldviews, that were already known in advance and for all time. Even if one accepts, as many do not, this difference between scientific and non-scientific thinking, it is important not to exaggerate its pervasiveness or decisiveness. When it comes to cosmic matters, individuals in non-scientific societies may well reason in a closed manner, yet it seems much less likely that they adopt this mode of reasoning in everyday matters. Unless they use an essentially experimental method in daily life, for example, rejecting foods that make one sick, they cannot survive. By the same token, even if Western scientists do indeed employ a method of reasoning that has allowed them to build the ever-changing structures of science, it is scarcely the case that they stand, in the rest of their lives, immune from aspects of closed thinking. In addition to whatever superstitious, mystical, or religious beliefs many of us hold on to unswervingly, an overall belief in science can be viewed as a kind of myth, one that scientists are as loath to relinquish as our non-scientific brethren are reluctant to abandon their own mythic poetic systems. Though scientific thinking may well yield a different worldview, one fundamentally alien to and even incommensurate with non-scientific worldviews, it need not entail a new form of intelligence. Rather, the scientist is characterized by a willingness to use linguistic and logical mathematical modes of thought in areas where they have customarily not been used before, for example, the devising of new notational systems or the positing of testable theories, and to combine them with careful observation in ways that have not generally been employed. Put differently, the components of the scientific method have existed for thousands of years, in any number of societies ranging from ancient China to classical Greece to medieval Islamic society. It has been the special genius of modern science to combine these sensory, logical, and linguistic approaches in a new way, and to dissociate them from the personal and religious forms of knowing in which they have been hitherto embedded. Just as it is possible to have literacy without the effects of schooling, it is possible to have schooling without the effects of science. Indeed, both the informal schools of the non-literate society and the traditional schools of the literate society have existed for many years without any involvement in the scientific world. It is even possible to feature logical mathematical thinking within the traditional school setting. In such instances, sophisticated linguistic and logical mathematical abilities are harnessed in order to justify certain predetermined conclusions. What distinguishes contemporary science, whether or not it is practiced in a schooled setting, is a particular use of logical mathematical thinking in order systematically to investigate new possibilities, to develop fresh explanatory frameworks, to test those frameworks, and then to revise or discard them in the light of the results. Interpersonal ties may well be important in the mastery of the scientific method, particularly for one who wants to collaborate with other workers. But in practice, much scientific work involves an immersion in one's own thought processes and the achievement of one's own ensemble of goals, ranging from the development of a particular computer program to an entirely novel scientific explanation. These activities exploit the intrapersonal rather than the interpersonal forms of understanding. In sum, while scientific thinking does not in itself entail any new form of intelligence, it represents a combination of intelligences that has hitherto not been utilized in this particular way. This form of thinking is possible only in settings with certain goals and values. Witness the plight of Galileo in his struggle with the Church, or of contemporary scientists in totalitarian societies. Like schooling and literacy, science is a social invention to which human intelligences can be marshaled only if the society is willing to accept the consequences. As one transitions from direct forms of knowledge to informal forms of schooling, from informal to traditional schooling, and from traditional to modern schools, there has been a steady minimization of bodily, spatial, and interpersonal forms of knowledge, first in favor of linguistic forms and then, increasingly, in favor of logical, mathematical, and intrapersonal forms of thinking. This shift can be seen clearly in the skills utilized by the three hypothetical students. The Puluwat sailor relies primarily on bodily and spatial capacities. Linguistic abilities assume importance at one point in the learning process, while logical mathematical capacities are scarcely at a premium. Both the Puluwat youth and the Iranian adolescent are embedded in an interpersonal situation. Each youth's relationship to the elders who instruct him assumes great importance for the success of the educational encounter. But where the Puluwat youth learns primarily in the natural context of sailing, the Iranian youth is mastering a far less transparent body of knowledge in a setting remote from significant daily activities. He is therefore thrown more squarely upon his linguistic capacities, which must include not only rote verbal memory, but the ability to crack the code of the Arabic language. An equally sizable gulf separates the Iranian youth from the Parisian composer at her computer terminal. While the skills necessary for the mastery of music and computing may well have been acquired in an interpersonal setting, this adolescent works chiefly alone. She must engage in a great deal of solitary planning about what she proposes to do and how she expects to carry it out. Thus, a much greater emphasis is placed on intrapersonal intelligence and an autonomous sense of self. Far more than her youthful counterparts elsewhere, she must rely on logical mathematical skills. Successful programming depends upon cultivated abilities in the numerical and inferential spheres. As a composer, she also deals with musical elements, central to her work. Were she involved in videographics or spatial reasoning, she would rely on still other forms of intelligence. By virtue of her engagement with computers, she must also deal with linguistic codes. But since various handbooks are available, she has no need to rely on the extensive memorization prized by the Iranian and Puluwat youths. Outside their particular learning settings, these individuals retain the option of using a much wider set of intelligences, and there is no reason to think they do not. Life consists of more than the deployment of particular combinations of intelligence for specific educational purposes. Moreover, these intelligences are not mutually exclusive. Cultivation of one does not imply that others cannot be acquired. Some individuals and some cultures may develop several intelligences to a keen extent, while others may highlight only one or two. One should not think of intelligences as involved in a zero-sum situation, nor treat the theory of multiple intelligences as a hydraulic model, where an increase in one intelligence necessarily entails a decrease in another. Still, on a statistical basis, different individuals and different cultures place their bets differently in their deployment of intelligences. It is possible to interpret the transition from the sailor to the Koranic scholar to the computer programmer as the course of progress. And indeed, from the Western perspective, the ability to create works of art on a computer can be seen as a crowning achievement. But it is equally possible to see this sequence as a systematic devaluation of certain forms of intelligence, interpersonal, spatial, or bodily, and as a destruction of certain important linguistic capacities. No less an authority than Socrates declared of writing, "For this invention of yours will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn it, by causing them to neglect their memory. Inasmuch as from the confidence in writing, they will recollect by the external aid of foreign symbols, and not by the internal use of their own faculty." The invention of technological aids may, paradoxically, leave an individual less prepared to rely on his own abilities. And the sequence witnessed in the Western world is certainly not the only conceivable one, and quite possibly not the optimal one. The evolution from a prescientific to a scientific way of thinking, from observational learning to schooling, and from non-literacy to literacy, may have worked with some smoothness in the West and certain other regions of the world. Yet the story of the West is not a universal saga, and it is a grave mistake to assume that it should be. Many of the most problematic aspects of modernization have resulted from an uncritical attempt to apply the model and history of the West to alien traditions, with different histories, educational customs, and favored blends of intelligence. How best to balance these various factors to produce effective educational systems is a vexing question, one to which no simple answer exists. However, in the concluding chapter, I will offer some speculations about how my theoretical framework might prove germane to such an effort. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.